Our topic today is the benefits of accelerating your application modernization journey with AWS. And leading our conversation today is our very own Mitchell Ashley.
Let's turn to our introductions.
So my name is Kat Morgan, and I'm a developer advocate at Pulumi. We are an infrastructure as code and cloud orchestration company.
My name is Perry Krug. I'm with Couchbase. I've been with Couchbase for a little over 13 years.
Good morning and welcome everybody, and thanks for having me, Mitch. I'm the Chief Product Officer of CloudBees.
My name is Johnny Wong. I am with Veracode. I am the Senior Director of Solutions Architecture.
Hi everyone, my name is Curtis Reese. I'm with AWS and been in AWS for about 8 years now.
I'm Chuck Friedman. I am also near Boston. Very relatively new to MongoDB, as some of you are in your roles. And I head up our developer enablement team within developer relations.
Well, let's turn to sharing a little bit of data with you. One of the things that we do with AWS and the App Modernization Community Partners is we do these things called pulse meters. They're a kind of a short form survey in the form of a poll where we take different topics and poll our audiences on DevOps.com and Security Boulevard, CloudNativeNow.com. To ask them kind of what do they think about certain topics. And part of those questions have been around app modernization. One of the questions we've asked is how many of your existing cloud-based applications will be modernized over the next 24 months? This is in the context of applications that you've already moved to the cloud. What kind of modernization efforts do you plan to do either now or the next 24 months? But in this data, we're close to approaching 50%, 43% of the people saying that over half of their apps they're planning to modernize, which I think is particularly interesting. So it isn't just about getting into AWS, which of course is a good thing. But once you're there, you want to be able to take advantage of not only moving to an architecture like cloud native, but also, there's a wealth of services. I think that's particularly interesting. And of course, you have, over 20% that are in that 20 to 50% range. So a lot of folks aren't just sitting idle after moving into the cloud. They've got plans. They're actively working on it. Some of the rank your top priorities for cloud for the remainder of 2023, looking near term. So this was polled, would have been late summer. So it's very recent data. Modernizing our applications validates what we just saw. Migrate existing workloads to the cloud. So it's not just modernizing apps, it's workloads across multiple applications, data, etc., of what you currently have both in and outside of the cloud. Improving your DevOps and performance, ensuring you've secured your workloads. I'm glad to see that's in there in the mix, and a couple of other items too around cost efficiency and also how do you operationalize the environment. I think this is a particular interesting data set here because we're asking how comfortable are you with your internal capabilities in the following areas about moving to cloud, about moving into AWS. And for some people, it's a brand new experience, right? They've not gone there. They don't have applications there, or they've not built them there. So we're going to break out into our modernization sessions, our breakout sessions. For modernization application dev workflow, one of the frequent questions that come up is, as I'm modernizing an app, do I change other things in the process? What about doing DevOps if I'm not doing DevOps either currently internally in my organization or maybe not for this particular application? Maybe you've moved a monolith up and you want to modernize it, or something that isn't necessarily built around a highly productive DevOps style iterative workflow.
Yeah, for our breakout session, what I'd like to get into is more of the conversation around the existing applications, the legacy applications that you have, and maybe some of the tech debt that's built up around that. Like, how do you include and incorporate some of the new processes and the modern ways of approaching things like infrastructure orchestration, management, security, observability to get the best bang for your buck to help address some of the core challenges that typically get pushed back when trying to modernize these applications?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of what you said in terms of accessibility and approachability. And I think if there was one thing that the cloud has done underpinning everything is bringing technology to the masses, and not just the masses of technologists, but the masses of anybody who wants to get their hands on it. And you see this represented in a lot of different ways, from APIs in software as a service through to just the cloud infrastructure itself. Not having to manage hardware, not having to physically plug anything in anymore means you can do it remotely. That's one layer. But then these layers and layers of approachability and accessibility are built on top of that. And AI is not in the business of putting developers out of business. AI is in the business of making everybody a developer. And if there's one thing that we as an industry need, is more people, more talent, more developers being able to build more things. And AI right now is at the top of that layer that's abstracting everything underneath. You can go in and ask for Copilot to write you an application, and it will. It might not be perfect yet, but it will write that application, where historically or previously, you needed to go through months, years of education and training to be able to just to articulate or translate an idea, a product idea, into running application. And AI in the last 6 months has just short-circuited all of that, and I think to the better.
One of the things I was thinking about, Perry, is to Shrudi's question. Even when you're modernizing, it doesn't mean you get to throw everything out and start completely from scratch, right? There is that kind of greenfield. Let's just build it from scratch again. It seems like those opportunities don't happen very often. We still have these things of how we do it, this kind of a database approach, or applications we have to interface to, or maybe just data management practices and platforms. What's your experience with the times you need to continue what you're doing and don't try to upset that part of the apple cart, versus where are good opportunities to look for changing? Maybe you move to NoSQL for this part of it, or for this part of it, or something like that.
I'm a big fan of going all the way back to the beginning of our discussion, right? Of picking and partitioning off and adding layers. And a lot of people out there will poo-poo adding more and more layers and abstractions, but I've seen just massive success with companies across all industries of saying, look, we can't turn off that database, we can't turn off that application, but we need to modernize, we need to compete, we need to add new capabilities, and so we're going to add a new service on top of it, and then maybe that's a V2 while the V1 is still there. Maybe that's a caching layer. Maybe it's a kind of an aggregation layer from a couple different services or databases that were not able to be joined together, but still exist, and using Couchbase and other databases to act as that presentation layer, if you will, on top of a system of record or on top of an application APIs, and then building new services on top of that. Certainly, there are plenty of people that don't have the expertise or the confidence to make it the one and only yet, and so adding a layer, building a service on top of it, building a proof of concept, a prototype very quickly allows you to gain that experience, gain that understanding.
Well, I had a set of very simple, straightforward, vectors of consideration when we went through the same process ourselves, right? When we build software here, we kind of think about it. We want to be as efficient as we can be. We want to be able to do it with the least amount of resources that we have, and we try to automate the heck out of everything that we can, so we don't have to do rote tasks over and over again.
You might summarize it too by saying, also looking at pain points, right? That you have, and then are those pain points impacting which the business is asking you to do? Like if reliability is an issue, right? Resiliency, if security is an issue, that some of those can be quantified or at least tied to why that's slowing you down, or you're spending resources trying to keep things going versus spending them on creating new capabilities. Or is it just being able to keep pace with what the business wants you to release for new features, functionality, iterate faster? Maybe they want to experiment and market. They don't want to commit to, launching the whole thing, but they want to be able to, try and do trials in market. So you kind of tie those things together with, and this is my set of issues, right? My challenges, right? That is impacting us. Are any of those connected to business value, the business outcomes? That's a lot easier to justify than we can write software better, or we'll be a little more secure, or those things that we know or think we should do but can't justify doing.
In all of this, and deciding what to change and what to modernize, and now that you're in the cloud, what can you do? Where does everybody sit on the build versus buy aspect, and does modernization, or should the lens of modernization be standardization as well, or relinquishing of non-core competencies by leveraging? I mean, you're already doing that by moving to IaaS, right? But are all different parts of your application, can you say, we don't really need to be in the payment processing business, so can we cut that out of our system to simplify our own, but then pass that on to a third-party service?
Those are definitely considerations we made along the way, Perry, and I think that's a good point that you bring up. That's an opportunity for everybody to ask themselves, is this, do we need to?
How about security?
It's a scary topic, honestly. It's the scary part of cloud, because it's so much easier to move data, to accidentally move it or expose it, or forget to secure some endpoint that's sticking off in a region somewhere. So it's definitely a much more important and much thornier part than it was in your own data center.
How about supply chain security, Sean? Thinking about the DevOps workflow and tool chain, we're much more aware.
We began building our platform, the DevSecOps platforms on AWS. We were, or me in particular, we were hell-bent on the fact that we need to rethink compliance and security. We need to rethink it. A lot of it was because if you think about it from code analysis, DAS type security, you think about compliance with FedRAMP, compliance with NIST, Fed, and compliance with ISO certifications and GDPR, and the list goes on of sort of things that we have to do. We realized that, holy cow, like there's so much of the topology of software development in the cloud native world that's constantly changing around the code. And coming back to sort of like the sequential processing map or patterns, we couldn't keep up with it. We came to the conclusion there's just absolutely no way that we will let those things live in the pipelines. We have to take them outside. We have to be able to standardize and centralize those controls. We wrote them in Rego, and we put an OP agent underneath it. And we said, we need to be able to monitor these environments constantly and point us to the parts and portions as developers related to sort of where we need to focus our attention. So,
Perry, I'm curious, what do you think about differently when you're modernizing an app in the cloud versus how you might have thought about the app when it's built today?
Yeah, I mean it's wide ranging, and it's very stylistic. It's very nuanced, depending on the individuals and the skills that they have, the technologies that they are comfortable and familiar with, and also the industry that you're in, and also the the constraints that you have placed on you of an existing application. That's true, but we still see lots of either temporal hybrid, where you just have to be managing multiple systems at a given point in time as you move through your journey, or persistent, kind of hybrid where you do need something that is a time series database and does that well, right? Or you do need something that is a graph database because your use case demands it.
Data is so different because it has gravity. You know, it has mass, whereas software can change, right? And data structures in the software can change, and we can convert that. You know, a schema change tends to live on, right? You're not just going to use it. Oh, let's go back to the old way it was. Also, location of data, the distribution of it. I mean, there are now easier ways to migrate data, consolidate it or distribute it, particularly in the cloud. But it isn't just the turn of a new piece of code, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but it has its own considerations that I think as a data person, you think about a lot more than maybe a software developer realizes.
I agree with that, although I would dampen the extreme in my world, and I have to place the legacy kind of database world separately. But when you are afforded the luxury of working with JSON from your database out to your API, you do have a lot of flexibility that the turn of a code change can add a record, can add a field to your JSON schema and not break everything else. You know, code, what we certainly have seen over the last 15 years with Couchbase and Mongo especially being very flexible document databases, we become much higher, much integrated, much more highly into the development lifecycle, and into you're controlling your database through code. You're controlling the schema, you're controlling the indexes, you're controlling even the scaling and the deployment. Really very well integrated with your CI/CD and your deployment pipelines all the way out to production to be able to roll out a new version of the API while you've still got the old version around. That's data, and you can do that where you couldn't 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and even when Couchbase and Mongo started, you couldn't do it all very well back then. So let's give everybody some credit and say you've only really been able to do that for the last 5 to 7 years. And there's a lot of people out there, a lot of people in our world that have not had that experience yet, and so it's an unknown. But I will say, and it's a mild plug for Couchbase, but it's a plug for document databases that just bring that flexibility and really elevate the database into the application itself, where if you're really thinking about them so separately as you had to with relational databases, you're not going to reap the benefits of a flexible data model.
What we want to talk about here is how do you implement some of the modern processes around your infrastructure, your development lifecycle, orchestration, automation, security, and observability to get the best out of the infrastructure that you have throughout your migration journey. I know there's lots of different migration pathways that we kind of tout. There's the typical lift and shift. There's migrate to managed. There's a lot of different plays that we have here. But as we start that journey, there's typically some things that you can benefit from turning on immediately. There's those things that, you know, if you did one thing and one thing only, like what would be that thing that you can actually, you should implement very quickly in that process to make it easier for you, build trust, like I said in the previous room, for your internal business team, so that we reduce the fear and the friction and help them see the benefits and the agility throughout the process and the visibility that can provide. You know, I don't know if any of you have seen, like, I don't know, Johnny, like how often do you see like cabs or change advisory boards in the development process that kind of pause things and hold things up because they want all of these checks and balances from a person? Like, how often do you see that?
It's not so much the cab or that pauses things. I think it's product security and even the developers themselves that kind of slow things down because they have a lot of pride in the work that they do, and they don't want to release something that has security flaws in them. It's just a security flaw is a bug, and we don't want to release bugs. And I didn't know, I didn't say it in my introduction, but I used to be a developer a long time ago. So I wasn't a particularly good developer, so that's why I'm not doing that anymore. I actually, short story, I had our head of engineering sit me down and say, you should go find a separate career, a different career in technology, but not be on my team writing code anymore. So humbling moment, but also a little bit like set me in the path that I reached now. But I'll tell this story about one of our customers who was going through this migration story. They're retail. I don't want to say what they sell, because as soon as I say it, you folks have interact with them at some point, everybody on this particular call. But it was a case where they were using an on-prem solution for security testing, and they were not getting the results that they wanted. And typically we would have security come in and say, we want something better, faster, stronger, more scalable, something in the cloud, obviously. But in this case, it wasn't the security team. The development team actually went to security and said, hey, the solution you purchased for us years ago, we don't like it. We want something else to get after the entire portfolio. And as especially as we're decomposing our applications, going cloud native, and there's just so many more moving parts, we need this. And the current solution is actually slowing us down. So, cut to the chase, short story, Verco came in, and not only do we offer more coverage in terms of all the microservices that we could actually assess, more scanning techniques. So the thought was at the beginning of the project, we're going to see so many more flaws. It's going to just bog everything down. They're going to create so many tickets, and everyone's going to get just freaked out and whatnot. And yeah, initially there were a lot more tickets, but at the end, as we're getting more adoption and more usage, they're actually getting better at what they're coding. So as they're building the microservices and the new components, they're introducing a lot less flaws as they're coding, not making the same mistakes they've done in the past. And their deployment times have actually decreased, even though they've increased their coverage by 10x and their scanning coverage by 4x. So you start doing numbers, it's like 400x if when you do want to multiply it, and they've actually decreased deployment time by adding more security upfront.
What are some of the biggest pain points that you see in this process that you think people should be aware of and be very forward in their thinking of approach? Like, what should they be thinking about as they embark on this journey?
Infrastructure as code as a vehicle to carry your team to success is really a core pillar of your successful journey, right? If you're traveling to a destination, you need a means to get there, and automation is basically serving that function in the cloud. ClickOps is really tempting a lot of times if you want to prototype something and test a new feature in the cloud. And what I mean by that, if you haven't heard the term ClickOps before, it's when you're spending all of your time in a web console and finding the menu for an S3 bucket, or figuring out how to attach an elastic IP address to a container service or things like that. And these can be good methods for exploring the cloud and understanding what you're moving towards. But then once you understand the underlying concept of attaching a load balancer, or whether or not to use a global load balancer and things like that, you need a pragmatic method to achieve that outcome without burdening your operations people, your developers, with the challenge of understanding what the GUI looks like today, documenting that, and then assuming that knowledge is going to be maintained in a quickly consumable fashion, so that over the lifetime of a service, multiple team members can flow in and out of an organization and still understand how to achieve that successful outcome without losing sleep at night, afraid that, in an outage, you're going to have to go untangle a web UI full of features to identify, problems and implement solutions and things like that. And with IAC, you end up with a very declarative known outcome, and that's shareable in much the same ways that containers gave us a common and shared method to distribute packages and software amongst each other with high confidence. in a successful outcome when running those applications. Infrastructure as code is almost like that Docker file experience for the cloud, so that you can write down the procedure and know that that procedure is going to be followed exactly every single time for reproducible results that are also auditable. Getting to that security piece, just knowing in code how to see your footprint and where you're exposed.
We do see in the container space this idea of GitOps, and that idea of like the code should identify what should be running and give us that auditability, so that if you see something that's not there, we have that ability to go back and say something's amiss, somebody needs to be alerted, so that it doesn't have to necessarily be human eyes on everything. But that correlation should be very clear to developers, and it makes sense to them. But as we go to the infrastructure side and say the SREs and the ops people, like, how do we make that clear, the value of that infrastructure as code and treating their infrastructure in that way and like leveraging those benefits? How do we address any friction or fear or uncertainty of like what that process looks like?
The biggest stressors, at least in my experience, were challenges in communicating needs across operations and dev teams, and confidence that when we reach a solution, it really is going to meet those requirements and acceptance criteria that were initially outlined for the success of a project. So by writing code, especially you mentioned GitOps, you have a common language of communication and interaction between your operations team and between your developer teams, so that even if something does go wrong, you have you have a foundational truth that you can all convene on, file an issue. You can come back and understand in code what went wrong, how that effect was produced, and how to resolve the issue and test for it in the future.
Hi, this is James. Now, this is a very interesting conversation, but whenever we get to that design phase, the initiation phase, one thing which comes as a challenge sometimes is how do you stage those things before you even deploy and get to production, right? But before you even get to that point of deploying something, there's an essential need of being tested or actually get to that phase of staging those infrastructure as code, or the code that you're writing for your infrastructure. Obviously, version control comes into play. All of those things comes into play. But there's always a challenge between staging versus what gets deployed in production. So what are your thoughts around that?
One of the first things that I look at when I am approaching a legacy architecture and I want to not just modernize it, but design a healthy and sustainable journey for that application into the cloud, is I'm going to go to the drawing board and see how that application is developed today. How are the actual developers setting up their local environments, if that's what they're using, and how are they making their testing methods repeatable from developer to developer? Because you want your application teams to have a shared understanding of benchmarking the successes that they're aiming for. And whether you are developing inside of, say, code-ready containers or something like that, or you're using VS Code and specific linters, and just making sure that at first the developers creating the applications are truly ready to confidently say at any given time, I achieved this outcome, and this is how my peers can also achieve the same outcome. That's a first step. Inconsistencies from developer to developer at that initial development phase are big friction points when you start trying to think about, now we're going to move off of our local system into a pre-prod scenario and into a testing and prod scenario. The more success you build into each phase and each step of the way towards that production outcome, the more reliable your transition from a pre-prod to a production journey is going to go as well. And then once you jump into designing your actual cloud architecture, there's a lot of choices that the developers and the operations team need to influence. Whether or not you are, so if you're deploying to Kubernetes, are you going to be using a database that is hosted in Kubernetes that is cloud native? Or are you going to use your cloud vendors' built-in database options like RDS and things like that? And these are decisions that ultimately impact the operations workload if they are maintaining a database on top of a Kubernetes. That is a new point of friction if you're going to do an upgrade or a blue-green deployment to replace your Kubernetes cluster and things like that. So holistically understanding not just what you want your application to live on in the end, but how those choices and cloud integration architecture design choices affect the, day 2 and beyond outcomes on the developers and on the operations team is definitely pivotal to designing a successful journey and the successful outcome in the end.
When you're doing something like even before pre-prod, something like, I'll give you a specific instance of CDN solutions, let's say Akamai, or for that matter, you're trying to do something, or you're trying to onboard or do something like an infrastructure as code for the web console configurations. Now you're trying to do as infrastructure as code for CDN solutions, where earlier it was all on the console. Now you're trying to do it as a code. You don't have any environment. It's fresh start, fresh initiative, fresh everything. You're trying to do it on your local first, try to do it on the stage, and then to do prod. There are quite a few challenges that comes into play because of the solutions that you're trying to implement there, because of the policies which are different in different environments, right? So the same policy that you're trying to define on your local, or probably for your local stuff, may not work on staging, may not work on production. It's different, but you're trying to do as a code now. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so on that note, I would strive to have consistency across your environments. And in the application space, you typically see this in, say, development frameworks where you have environmental variables. And so even though you're connecting to a specific endpoint that is locked down to dev instances and maybe not accessible to the outside world and beyond, and prod may be a little bit different, at the end of the day, the code that is being deployed and the integration points and the mechanisms for that should be versioned and consistent across the tiers. And it's when you're not doing that level of consistency that you'll run into some of those tripping points. And it's very important to have that consistency, because if you're looking at how things are going to scale out, if you want to hope to do specific testing against an environment to understand, is load going to be consistent? Can we stress test this environment? Can we make sure that these things are going to perform the way we would expect in prod? You have to have that level of consistency. And that's why it's really critical to version the infrastructure and be very consistent with the endpoints that you're connecting to, where you also have to understand not every endpoint has to be on the same tier. So the endpoint, if it's an Akamai endpoint or an API that you're consuming, you may not necessarily have to connect to a dev instance of that endpoint. You might be able to use a production endpoint from your dev environment for your application. And so be cognizant of those kind of scenarios where is this a component of the application or a required part that needs to be versioned, or is this simply just a downstream consumer or an upstream consumer? And being clear in the definition of your infrastructure to help modify that and incorporate that into the story. So that way, you really understand what is the component that you own and are responsible for that specific application, so that when you go to dev, when you go to staging, when you go to prod, all the testing can be run consistently across that. This is one of those scenarios where, from a code perspective, if you're doing this, where it's on my machine, and then I have to go and change some stuff on the staging environment, you're already off on the wrong foot, because then you have no guarantee that if you walked away, could that be consistently deployed across the tiers?
That's where version control would come into play in different.
Yeah, and that's a challenge for a lot of customers, of thinking about their infrastructure as a versioned object. It's in the code, and that's why Pulumi comes into play. That's why CloudFormation or CDK come into play, because they give you that chance to look at your code from like your infrastructure from a purely code perspective and say, okay, for this version of our application, we expect this version of our infrastructure. They don't have to be tightly coupled, because typically the infrastructure has to go before the code does. The same where database changes would typically go before the code does, or vice versa, depending upon the change that you're making. You have to be very cognizant of that. Now, that does lead to an interesting conversation. And thanks, James, for hopping on. I really do appreciate the participation here. This does lead to an interesting conversation. So as we go through this process, how do we incorporate the necessary components that come along with it? So when we look at, say, like security, how do we make sure that the security components are built into that process, along with, say, like, well, we need X number of servers. So it's like, what are the larger processes that we have to incorporate into that larger strategy? So like from a security perspective, like how do we get that into the development lifecycle? So not just on the code level, but also on the infrastructure level. So Johnny, like where should they start in that journey as they're looking to codify their infrastructure? How do they incorporate some of that vision into it?
I would say it starts with like education. A big part of the developer, I guess, I don't know, like life cycle, not a life cycle, but career is not rooted in security. It's I'm gonna write something. I have a feature to put out. I have a specific timeline, and I'm gonna get that out because that has a bonus tied to it. There's MBOs tied to it. Whatever, you know, incentives tied to it. I'm gonna do that. And people don't think about security. People don't train on security. If you look at the top, let's say 50, computer science curriculums, none of them have security as a required course. Some of those curriculums might have security as an elective, and elective just means that I don't really have to take it to get a degree. And then you have a whole bunch of folks coming into the workforce with no security background. The company doesn't typically say in their handbook, the developer's handbook, if they have one, to say, hey, security first. We have to make sure we, put out whether it's infrastructure as code, whether it's the actual code that you're writing for the application, the functionality needs to be secure. None of that. So I think it really starts with like the education to like have some of the fundamentals, and this is beyond the security awareness training that we have to take every year. But really understand what you put into the application. It goes back to the old computer science adage of garbage in, garbage out. So if you have insecure code, infrastructure, and whatnot, shared secrets in there, you are doomed to, repeat the errors of the past again and again, but just much faster in a cloud native environment.
That's a very interesting way to put it. Yeah, this is incredibly important as we look at modernizing our applications, because one of the targets that everybody talks about, and Kat, you even brought this up earlier, is EKS or Kubernetes. Like people want to move to Kubernetes, and when you look at the Kubernetes landscape, there's like 3,000 different projects that you could pull in from all these cloud native open source initiatives. And your point, Johnny, like a lot of those are consumers of other downstream solutions and libraries and code bases. And it may not even be from a security perspective. I remember an example from maybe 10 years ago with Node.js, where one of the projects that actually produced a random number generator that was one of the most consumed like libraries that so many code bases leveraged, decided just to take theirs offline. And so suddenly when they would deploy these applications, suddenly all these things that were based off of this random number generator were completely like hosed. And it wasn't even a security issue. It was just a visibility issue. No one knew that this was a downstream thing. And when either a license changed or that was removed, it was suddenly going to have such a pervasive impact. And so getting that visibility, especially when you're trying to version your infrastructure, like you said, the SBOM aspect of it, like what is included in this bill of materials from an infrastructure perspective or an integration perspective, and then also a code perspective. Like, am I pulling in my libraries? Have those been scanned? Like oftentimes we don't think about that, but it's those moments that come up where it's like the Java example, where suddenly you've got this threat and it's not even something your developers created. And it may even be out of their hands to address directly. And we may have to come in very quickly. And so yeah, exactly, Kim. Visibility is such an important thing, because imagine your teams are trying to keep track of these things. And so if a new vulnerability came in, getting that visibility into which applications may be affected, which pieces of infrastructure may be affected, getting that SBOM and being able to track and report against it, that can be the difference. If we say, I think the stat was every minute of downtime for a company costs $100,000 to the business. And so if it takes you 2 days to sift through all those code bases to find that one application that's using one of those downstream ones, or you can scan it automatically or have an AI tool scan that and tell you which ones are affected directly, that can be hundreds of thousands of dollars because you can shorten that time to identify which ones are affected and remediate. Any thoughts or comments on that one before we move on to an even more interesting topic? Not that this isn't.
Yeah, I just want to continue on the Log4j experience we've all had a couple of years ago. Veracode has a lot of data about our customers because it's cloud native. We know everything that goes on with respect to the application security, and we have this report called the State of Software Security report that comes out every year or so, and we basically assess all of our customers' scanning activities and code base and things like that. There was a special Log4j section that talked about how when it happened, we were immediately able to provide visibility to our customers. You're using Log4j, you are on this particular version, so you need to go and do something because, like you said, downtime is not something that's truly acceptable. And we actually have had some customers who said our strategy is to go shut down a bunch of websites until we figure out what to do and what not. Now, the most interesting thing, or one of the most interesting things, is that we found that actually about 40 to 50% of our customers weren't really affected by Log4j because they weren't on the version that was affected. Their versions were so old that they're not even concerned about the Log4j incident from 2 years ago. There were probably many years before an update before they would actually be affected. So that was eye-opening too. And in another way where the libraries were so old that let's say they were to take something off the market, like your Node.js example, it would cause other issues. But so it was kind of a good thing that they weren't so updated and secure, that they were saved from the Log4j incident in a way.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We like talking through this process. We've talked about how to look at the infrastructure and how do we include the code into that story, and what should we be looking at from an automated perspective. You made an interesting mention around Gen AI and how we can leverage Gen AI in that space. And this is where I'd like to turn to Chuck. And a lot of times we look at MongoDB as a document repository, and we look at it just as a component of the applications. But what can we do from an infrastructure and visibility perspective and an observability perspective with things like MongoDB and Atlas that can really show how to get visibility into the application in your infrastructure so you can understand what's going on in the space? So it's once we've built that code and we're now securing that code, how do we get a view into what's actually going on with it?
So I think I should start just sort of on the general position of it, and for folks new, as most are, it's interesting how the data is going to come into I think your infrastructure, right? Because in most cases you're vectorizing data, you're converting it to arrays. So you could be in Gen AI, you could be taking things from anything like a PDF or an image, or I just heard a really interesting use case about vectorizing sounds for comparative solutions, like diagnosing sounds your car makes, so you can know what service you need. So data is not coming straight into your database now. It's going through other intermediary services. So you're reliant on other services, other code before the data actually gets in, and then it's set either into some sort of a vector embedding or context of other data that's going to be used. So from an infrastructure standpoint, just listening to Kat's comments and Johnny's comments, there's just a lot on the periphery of your solution that I think you have to be aware of from a security standpoint, from a scalability standpoint, before things even get into your application that you're going to leverage. So I find that really interesting, and I've definitely learned that perspective from this conversation. Where Atlas, you mentioned Atlas, Curtis, so it's heavily dependent on cloud. And where your stack lives in relation to your database is obviously something to consider, because performance-wise, yes, the data lives, in MongoDB or whatever data store you're using, but other applications and other processes that you're using, especially asynchronously, will trigger certain events. So in some cases, you might be waiting for processes to complete, especially if in Gen AI, if like something like vectorization is happening. And there's a whole other piece of this, which is I think what makes this space even more exciting is the availability of all these frameworks like a long chain, which essentially set up this workflow for you that's going to be so new to so many, development cycles. How you leverage that, how you choose the right solution relative to your traditional data store, relative to, which cloud provider you're using. I do think that, like, I'm thinking Pulumi, I'm thinking, obviously other deployment tools, CloudFormation, those are really going to become quite valuable to make this all simple and this all packaged together. So when it comes time to get into this space or deploy what hopefully would be a reliable solution, you might not be going down the shopping cart, the shopping aisle of all various solutions and saying, I want that, I want that. It might all be nicely prepackaged together and hopefully vetted, again, from a scalability and security standpoint.
How should people be looking at this with perspective from each of you? Like, how are you looking at them individually and incorporating Gen AI to help with the modernization journey? I know, Johnny, you mentioned something. I'm open to all of you. You don't have to pick on just one of you, but like, what do you think that the audience should be paying attention to in that space around app modernization? Yeah. Like, what is the key thing? Like, we need to wrap up in a moment. I want to make sure.
Jump on it really fast. Chuck and Johnny both mentioned key parts of scaling security posture in a way that's not just going to lead to information overload and fatigue, but actually empowers the developer or the ops personnel to achieve an improved outcome quickly with informed and knowledgeable recommendations about your next steps. And I think that's one of the most powerful components of infrastructure as code, because now you can actually create libraries of security posture as code. So if you have network policies, or if you have, say, policies for public and private classes of S3 buckets or what have you, you can create a library that enforces the compliance for those infrastructure components, and then offer those internally inside of your own organization for consumption by other teams delivering their platforms, and include versions in your infrastructure tags. So if you're tagging an S3 bucket or tagging a subnet or tagging deploying a load balancer, you can actually enforce compliance and see awareness. Say with Pulumi Cloud, for example, you can query your state across multiple clouds all at one time to say, what resources do I have deployed that are tagged 1.3, if you will. And you can see, say you've released an update to your security posture for your infrastructure, and now you're on 1.4, you can query your cloud infrastructure from the state in natural language all of a sudden to understand what infrastructure you're running on legacy, security posture, and understand that you just need to go into those downstream infrastructure as code repositories and flip the version of the library that you're importing, which is enforcing that security posture. And that reduces the fatigue on the person responsible for implementing the new procedure. All they have to do is bump the library version to the current enforced security posture from the library published by the security team, if you will.
Yeah, I think just from a Gen AI perspective, folks would just have to consider more about like what is the responsible AI that you're using. There's a lot of whether it's sound, whether it's text, whether it's pictures. You always have to consider like what is the source that this AI is drawing from and what is it generating. I can almost think back, maybe it was like 20 years ago or maybe more, when internet became more of a common thing and people kind of say like, well, I read it on the internet, so it must be true. So it's kind of, there's another inflection point here where it's like, well, it's generated by AI, so it must be accurate, it must be true because it's based on all this data and things like that. But there is bad data out there. There could be, data could be poisoned. So you really, when you're choosing an AI solution, you just really have to consider the responsibility of it, the learning model, the data set that it's being trained on and whatnot before you go jump into it. And obviously avoid the snake oil salesmen who just slap AI in front of their product, after many, many years of selling it, all of a sudden AI is the new thing. And they put in there like blockchain from a couple of years ago. It's like, oh, blockchain this, blockchain that. And it just becomes a lot of noise. So I think I would caution folks to dig a little deeper before, diving deep into it.
Now that we've got everybody together here, we have kind of final thoughts. Take as long as you want to have each of you just, if it's summarizing or something you picked up from this conversation or the questions really kind of piqued your interest in thinking about. Curtis, why don't you start us out?
Honestly, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me and recommendations to the team is to always keep your ear down to what's available out there. Like I said, there's lots of things that you could be doing to modernize your applications. Just take your time, focus on the thing that's most relevant to your business requirements, and work backwards from those to identify what needs to be put in place. If it's cost and scaling, find ways to address that in a meaningful way and start there. If it's security, find a meaningful way to get that. If it's observability, if it's modernizing your databases, start where you need to provide the most value and then grow your maturity and expand that footprint over time. You don't have to start and get it all done in one day. It's a growth and evolution. And honestly, that work is never done to begin with because there's always going to be new tech. So don't feel like you have a destination you have to hit with that. It's more about just ongoing evolution and growth and your abilities.
Great. Kat, how about you?
When it comes to infrastructure as code, if you find that you're practicing a given task multiple times, if you do it once and you never will do it again, you can skip the idea of automating it. But if you're doing it twice, and especially if you're doing it 3 times or more, it's time to sit down and unburden yourself from the liability of having to perform one thing over and over. And that's the whole promise of infrastructure as code, is it relieves the burden on any practitioner who finds themselves repeatedly performing any given steps to achieve a business outcome. So if you're running a command or going to the same place in a web UI and you find that you can automate that, prioritizing that automation will free you up to then progress on and start to achieve other things without the fatigue of just keeping the lights on every day.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Very well said.
Johnny, jump in.
Sure. So I think it's really important to emphasize teamwork, especially when we talk about modernization and you have development, ops, security, all working together and having that common goal. I mean, obviously bringing the application to market, improving it. But from a security perspective, understanding what are we trying to do. So if there is any kind of instant gratification of let's shortcut something, let's not do that and think about the longer term, how do we build a sustainable, scalable process to secure applications now as we're migrating and modernizing, and also in the future when you're maintaining.
All right, how about Chuck? And we'll wrap up with you, Perry.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on what I heard from conversation with Curtis, Johnny, and Kat. There's 2 thoughts. One is there's in automation, in packaging solutions. I mean, it's not just for the efficiency of our organization, but I also think about new hires or new engineers coming into the team and how to have this sort of ready-made deployment just gets folks going so much faster and not just coding, but gives them a chance. Maybe it's a deployment to staging where they can see how things play out. They become a little bit more ramped up faster in your best practices and what your infrastructure is. The other term that I'm taking away from this is the software bill of materials, the SBOM, and just the assessment, that inventory of what makes up your infrastructure, your solution from a security standpoint, but also just knowing all your dependencies across libraries, across data stores, and as we look into Gen AI, especially where other services you might be dependent on to build that solution.
Fantastic. Go for it, Barry.
Wow. Going last leaves me with very little to say. Really, really great points, everyone. Curtis, I think you put yours particularly well in my mind of the incremental nature and the always moving forward aspect of it. I think if I was gonna bring one thing from our previous conversation, Mitch, was we're not doing this just for the fun of it. Our businesses are not moving to the cloud just because they can, and they're not picking an application just to burn it to the ground and rewrite it from scratch just for the fun of it, right? And so there's always got to be a reason. There's always got to be a desired outcome, whether you reap that or not is to be reflected on. But make sure you're doing something for a reason. Not just because it's cool, not just because someone told you it's the newest bleeding edge technology, but that you have a business reason or an internal efficiency reason, whatever that is. Is it delivering features faster in your competitive market? Is it making your developer lives better? As Chuck said, is it being able to bring on new people faster and get them productive in your organization? There's lots of different reasons to do things, and then focus on that and make sure you know why you're doing something. You have a reasonable path to success for it.
Wonderful. I have two final thoughts. One I popped into the chat there. You can read that. I'm going to save my second one until Cody is here and let him do his magic, and then I'll pop back in and share my last thought.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Mitch. So I'm here to give out our 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our winners are Catherine S., Richard B., Shruti S., and Douglas O. So to our 4 winners, keep an eye on your email inbox. Wait out for an email for me. I'll be contacting you soon to distribute these gift cards to you. If you don't happen to see an email in your inbox, check your spam folder just in case it happens to be filtered out. All right, Mitch, I'll pass it on back over to you for now.
Fantastic. I won't wax on too long poetically, but yes, we are here to deliver business value, to do these things that impact the business positively and our customers, stockholders, et cetera. That's very important. I also want to appeal to you that.
Oh, it looks like you got muted, Mitch.
Oh,
Mitch, you muted yourself.
Of course I did. There we go. Okay. Of course I did. I wanted to implore everybody, yes, we're delivering business value and impact to the business and our customers, but this is a lot of fun. There is so many things to learn and experience, whether it's helping develop your career or you just get jazzed out of doing this kind of work. It is a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing the work that we do today more than I've ever done any time in my career, and you can tell I've been around for a little while. So remember to have fun while you're learning all this great stuff and doing cool things and helping your customers and your business as well. I just want to finish by thanking everyone who's been a part of putting this together. Maureen has been our kind of fearless leader in pulling this all together and making this happen. We couldn't have done it without you. And of course, our team at Techstrong, Cody and Jared and Kim and Julio and all the people behind the scenes that help pull this together. Really want to have you check out the Builders Community Hub, that link at the top. You can always go to devops.com and find it there. So turn it back to you, Cody, to wrap up. Thank you to our panel, and thanks again.